going to have a closing address from John Cook, my colleague from UEA, a colleague in more senses than one, in that we've been involved in this outpost of UEA in India together, and he was in fact the person who invited me to join UEA when he was Dean of the Arts and the Humanities, and then later after that in 2012 asked me whether starting teaching workshops in India was a good idea. So that's how it began, and John has been at every symposium to deliver the closing address as only he can, so I'll leave it to him now.
Thank you. That's all right. I want to go back to nearly where we started, and just say that I'm suffering at the moment from a triple embarrassment. I'm a little embarrassed that this is called the closing address. It really would be better named something like Fleeting Impressions, and I'll be giving some fleeting impressions in a moment. I think the second thing to say is it's just impossible for me to do justice to the presentations that have happened over the last 2 days. I can't pretend to start summarizing them or illuminating certain points from them, although they're all swirling around in my mind, and I feel propelled forwards by them. It's been certainly, from where I've been listening, an exhilarating experience in ways that I hope I'll be able to make clear. And I guess, is it an embarrassment? I think the third embarrassment is to do with the fact that this is the moment or the time when this comes to an end. And it's always quite difficult to... Is it embarrassing to mark an ending? I don't know. Maybe it is. But so there are three sorts of embarrassment that are preoccupying me a bit at the moment. But then I don't feel that I have to do justice to something. I feel I want to respond to something, and I want to just think about my responses in three ways. And I don't want to spend too long on my 3 ways, about 10 minutes for each way. So that will bring the session and the whole event to an end sometime around 5:10. In the first thing I want to say, comment on, I do want to talk about time, because a number of the presentations that we've heard, not least the one that we've just heard, has been about time, and it has been part of the displacement of storytelling, or the critique of storytelling even, that storytelling precludes certain experiences of time. And the first of those we were thinking about yesterday as the time of embarrassment, and Tiffany Atkinson, in her talk, set forth the proposition or the thought that one of the problems about storytelling is that it, as it were, wants to tidy up certain kinds of awkwardness, and that this in turn can become part of a certain institution of literature which seeks to sublimate awkwardness into something grander, like shame or something more epical. Whereas she wanted to stay true to, and staying true to something is very important, I think, in all of the papers or talks. She wanted to stay true to the fact that embarrassment is a time, is a feeling which cannot, in a sense, be soothed by storytelling. It can't even be understood by storytelling, and instead and here's the first kind of connection with a certain larger sense of time. We're in the waiting room. Okay, we're in the waiting room with Elizabeth Bishop, and the embarrassment that finds a certain kind of lyric, is it? A certain kind of lyric utterance there. The embarrassment of being seen to be reading something that might make you appear to be odd to the other people who are in the waiting room. And waiting is something that I was thinking about in two ways, and in a way that connects with the notion of life, which is, I think, one of the things that I have most enjoyed here is those talks, and there have been a number of them. Amit's today, certainly, Govinda's and Jean-Frédéric, but not only those three, who've sought to affirm the idea that art can itself affirm life, and that, again, a second critique of storytelling is that it actually restrains such affirmations or such recognitions of the possibility of life in time. If you're in the waiting room, and I think here also of that wonderful moment in Geoffrey's poem when the soldiers are on the ship. They're in a sense in a version of a waiting room, and what they're doing is they're reading a piece of pulp fiction, and they're sharing it by the person who's reading it first tearing the page off and passing it on to his fellows. Very interesting idea about reading that I still haven't quite resolved in my mind. But there's an interesting thing about the relationship between waiting and life, and it's summarised for me in a wonderful exchange between Ham and Clov in Endgame. Ham says, I think it's Ham who says, is there a life to come? And Clov says, mine's always been that. And so how does that extend for me into what I was listening to this morning? Well, when I saw, I thought the presentation of the prologue, as it was called in Govinda's talk, and the information that prologue was excised, or at least became a condition of it being shown at a festival that it should be excised, is one of a number of what I would almost want to call allegorical moments in this symposium. That is to say, it seemed to me to concentrate so much about the difficulty of artistic practice today, a certain kind of artistic practice anyway. But I was also thinking about Anjum's response to that sequence, and what was, she felt that there was a sense of menace or foreboding in it. I think I felt something like that, but what I wanted to say was that what was for me remarkable about that sequence was that life was happening. We were seeing life happening for this group of people, but there was also a sense of waiting for something to happen as well, and that double presentation of something happening and at the same time waiting for something to happen was part of what seemed to me to be what moved me about that. And there we moved into a rather different sense of time, which is captured, of course, by the allusions to Bergson, and Bergson has been an important thinker in this, in the background of some of the things that have been spoken about here, of duration, and of course of Deleuze's account of the time image in cinema, of the image which will in some sense capture time rather than action. Duration and the relationship there between I was thinking about the relationship between duration and endurance as an experience of time. And that in turn took me back to a very interesting remark, at least in my audition of it, that was made by Udaya yesterday, when he, in discussing the role of Dalit autobiography, cautioned us against reading these stories, and we were back in the domain of stories now, as the vehicle for the affirmation of agency, when in fact where the story's real centre lay was in the endurance of humiliation. And I think that raises a very interesting question about the extent to which stories either address or dress up a certain kind of condition, which is a political condition as well as a condition of the experience of time. When I felt as a pair, in a sense, I thought Jean-Frédéric and Amit were in a very interesting kind of dialogue with each other in some senses, because I've been talking to Jean-Frédéric outside these meetings, and I've been trying to come to terms with a certain kind of radicalism in what I think he's doing. I was talking to him yesterday about the idea of working without a rule, okay? Just seeing what happens, what emerges, having no preconception or no rule. And a practice of making, and one of the good things about these events is that they are about the practice of making material, of poesis, as that was invoked earlier, that what you do is you see what emerges and then you enter into an activity of combining elements according to certain sorts of structural possibilities almost. But what you're doing there is it's not that the life of the work will be given in the moment of its instantiation. It won't be, as it were, predicted beforehand. It won't be planned beforehand. And that led me just to a reflection about how, and this I want to pick up on this very powerful remark that Amit made in his talk about a certain kind of hostility that exists in the culture to opening things up, which I think has been another theme. I was just thinking about the way in which the way you work would be impossible, almost impossible to do where I work in a university. I was thinking about what would happen if, when I gathered together with a group of my students, I just said, okay, well, there's a text. Let's see what happens. People would get very, very uneasy. They would feel cheated. They would feel that they were being taken out of some kind of contract. Whereas I feel, actually, that something might happen which would be infinitely more valuable to them than what usually happens. And I do think that addresses an issue that we've addressed, Amit and I have thought a lot about before, and it's there in the literary activism collection, which is about what's possible in universities now. What is possible in universities now, even though, as it were, they have ostensibly an affirmation of the creative in their creative writing programs and so on and so forth. In fact, I mean, are these things really now somehow becoming other than what they appear to be? I think, for me, it's a very vexing question, but it's one that arose in the thinking about time. In Amit's case, I think, again, what seemed to me to be happening there was this setting forth of all the different ways in which you read beginnings, in which you experience the possibility of a beginning. And that instead of, therefore, going to literature for the experience of narrative or a certain kind of connection, a certain kind of consequentiality, a certain kind of fitting of things together, if you think of one of the classic functions of plot, and this goes back to, I think, Scheukert's remarks about enlightenment as well. One of the classic features of plotting under the conditions of enlightenment rationality has been that a plot will make things that you didn't know knowable. I mean, it does have that fairly, primitive, if you like, commonsensical epistemic function. So mysteries get solved, who's related to whom gets solved, and I think that, I mean, I can't absorb all the implications yet. I want to think about it further. But I think the idea of a literary experience which is not focused upon that kind of resolution, but focused upon those moments, what he said, were sometimes called hinge moments, instead in narrative thought. No, the hinge moments are the things that are the most important features of the text, and that means that we don't read for narrative consequence. We don't read it in relationship to the imperatives of narrative consequence. There's much more to be said about that, and I'm thinking obviously about Charles's wonderful play on the notion of now time, of Jetztzeit, of the time of the now, and wondering, and I'm not trying to be simply philosophically paradoxical here, about the relationship between the time of the now and is there a life to come? Mine has always been that. Of the living in the time of happening and of waiting to happen. And I'm not, that's just a mystery that I want to think about a bit more. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about, by way of beginning to pull some things together, is this question of narrative and the relationship of narrative to story and narrative to plot. And I think one very important thought that has provoked this symposium is this address to the notion of storytelling as the authentic form in which a culture expresses itself. I think is especially connected to identity politics, in fact, as well as being the mode in which an identity is affirmed. And if I had more time, I would want to unpick the questions that seem to me to lurk in identity politics, but I don't have time to do that. But I just think it's worth noting that coincidence. And Amit also reminded us, or told us, that this was a phenomenon, this affirmation of the value of storytelling, that goes with a certain moment in the history of capitalism that we come to awkwardly call globalization. That this was part and parcel of this whole phenomenon. Now, one thing I think that is worth adding to that, which has been struck me, is that actually before that moment, what you had in different kinds of literary theory and criticism was a thinking through of the centrality of narrative, and there are many, many texts that could be adduced here. Obviously, the work of Roland Barthes, the famous structural analysis of narrative essay, but also Frederick Jameson, with his notion of narrative as cognitive mapping, as he calls it in the, I think it's in The Political Unconscious, I can't remember exactly which book it's in now, but there was within the realm of theory, and it also goes back to Levi-Strauss, actually. I mean, I think Levi-Strauss's structural analysis of myth is another of the motor forces that actually lie behind this affirmation of narrative, and in particular his thought that what mythical narratives do is perform the imaginary reconciliation of real opposites. That's to say, mythical narrative is thought about under the sign of synthesis. And I think that what is strange to me, I just want to register that strangeness, is the way in which, again, is it a paradox, that thought, in a sense, and the value that thought gave to narrative, found itself coinciding at the same time with this affirmation of the value of storytelling. So that there was a kind of double movement here of theoretical justification and storytelling. And what's important about that is not simply to observe the conjuncture, but to notice what happens to the status of narrative in that thinking, which is that it becomes, in an almost Kantian sense, a condition of experience. It becomes a condition of experience. And the number of conferences I remember going to during this period in which somebody or another would actually be telling me, as though it was a discovery, that without narrative, there would be no experience. Okay? So the story would go that, when I wake up in the morning, it's a condition of my experience that I begin to project a story forward about what I'm going to be doing during the day. That storytelling is in some sense integral to cognition, or integral to having a consistent self, for example. All these things seem to me to come together. And one of the emancipatory forces of this event has been to kind of blow that apart in some sense and say, no, we can start from another place. Let's start from another place. There are a couple of other things just to note there. One is that and on a number of occasions, and I think it's very important this, we have been alerted to the fact that we shouldn't simply conflate narrative with story and plot. I do think that's worth holding. I do think it's worth inhabiting that tension and realizing that narrative is not simply to do with telling stories. I mean, it can be to do with many other things as well. We were reminded about Joyce and the textual markers that go into that text in a way that aren't to do with narrative sequence or consequence. I mean, that's just one example of how narrative can work. So there's that point about narrative and story and plot, which don't simply coincide, but which nonetheless need to in some way be thought together, and we have been thinking about how they overlap and then how they separate out. But it's very interesting to me if we're now coming to the end of, or finding our way out of, a moment which actually, in a sense, began not simply in the 1980s and 1990s, but in the 1960s, the late 50s, the 60s, with the emergence of the structural analysis of narrative. And as I say, the corresponding thought that narrative is actually a condition of experience. And if you go to Amit's paper, Amit's talk, one of the things that Amit showed us through his account of life is, of course, that it isn't that there is always something outside narrative which enables it to exist. That's something that we need to hold on to. The third thing I want to say has to do with modernism and the legacies of modernism. Partly, obviously, because it's been alluded to already. Shoykut alluded to E.M. Forster, if you think of him as a modernist, aspects of the novel. Oh dear me, the novel tells a story, and I wish it wasn't so. Some words to that effect. But of course, Forster was a muted voice in the modernist dismantling of narrative. You just have to think of Virginia Woolf, Mr. Bennet, and Mrs. Brown, or Eliot's essay, Eliot's review of Joyce's Ulysses, Order and Myth, which very explicitly opposes the mythical method, as he calls it, to the narrative method, and is about the fact that narrative methods are no longer adequate to the reality which he seeks to explore. Or there's Paul Valéry's impatience with novel writing. I can't remember exactly where it comes, but Valéry gets very irritated with sentences like, she got up from the table and went to the door. and he does it, he gets very irritated by it because he thinks it's a false instrumentalization of language. He thinks it distracts us from what literature should be about, which is the materiality of language and the fact that what comes to speak in literature is not narrative but language. I mean, that's a Heideggerian thought as well, but I won't stray into Heidegger because that's a bit too heavy duty, perhaps. So that is salient to modernism, and I just wanted to go briefly back to Anjum's talk yesterday on. I don't know the work of Kiran Nagaka, but I was very struck by the account she gave of both the move in Nagaka's career, I think, from a sort of modernist method to a more conventional storytelling method. I'm not sure about that, but particularly about the role of Manu Joseph, I think was the author, who, and the reason I was very interested in it is because it seems to me a symptom as well as an event here. Something almost exactly the same has just happened in English culture, British culture, because the Arts Council of England, of which I used to be a part, has published a report which is about, it's called Literature in the 21st Century. Literature in the 21st century, in this report, is defined by what it refers to as a crisis in literary fiction, in the status of literary fiction, and the precipitating fact of that crisis is that you can't make a living writing literary fiction any longer unless you're part of a tiny little group of authors who, as it were, are the 1% of the literary fiction world. And what did that provoke by way of a public discourse? Well, it provoked a number of pieces written in against literary fiction, saying the problem with these people is they don't know how to tell a story. Okay? And until they get round to telling good stories, you know, why should they expect any favours from the likes from us? You know, from that was asserted as the basic contract between writer and reader, and that if you started to dither around with that, you were, you know, just decreeing your own futility, or some such thing. You were colluding in your own penury, right? I mean, it's just astonishing. You know, this is an example of this hostility, okay? This is an example of the way in which this hostility to the opening up of space is bears down upon us. In the ease with which these things are said, you know, in the confidence with which these things are said. I mean, what the outcome of all this is going to be, I don't know. But what is very, very striking, I think, is the way in which, you know, an argument here finds almost an exact equivalent in an argument in my, you know, bit of the world, and it is about the fact that all we really can cope with now in this sort of time is stories that help us to go to sleep, and the more extensive they are and the more soporific they are, the better, right? Because they'll just help us. They'll help us through whatever it is that is happening to us. And in the process, of course, what we will do is, in some sense, lose that capacity for experience, which it seems to me all the presentations here have somehow been pulling us back towards. I mean, towards the fact of the creation of it, creating experiences. What art does is create experiences. The thought of life in the text is precisely important. It's important for a number of reasons. One of the reasons it's important is because it breaks from mimesis. Okay, this is not a mimetic notion of the relationship of what is in a text to what is outside it. It's rather a much more interesting notion of what enables a text to be what it is. So I have those three. You know, those are the three sort of areas that I just wanted to map out. Is it a map? No, it's probably a kind of chaos. But I mean, the question of time and the inadequacy of a certain mode of storytelling as it's come to be construed in giving us access to these experiences of time, because of course the experiences of time are also the experiences of emotion, and that we need to bear that in mind when we're thinking about the range of feeling and that comes into any literary work. I mean, I've been writing, oddly enough, about T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland recently, and I've just been so taken aback again by the fact that this is a poem which opens itself up to experience in a way that other poems had not. I mean, it does it in a very intricate way, but the range you get in that work, and this is actually an important part for Eliot of the mythic method, is the mythic method is interestingly acting for him as a way of lifting a certain kind of censorship. It enables him to bring into the work things that he says the legislator or the moralist would not want to see there. A very interesting distinction that he makes at that point, and that was what modernism, as Eliot was saying, helped happen, and we need it to happen again. It seems to me as one of the it is happening, it's still happening, but it's also the case that it is under an enormous amount of pressure, I think. So. That's what I want to say in relationship to the to the events, the talks and the events that have been happening. But I do now want to move into a slightly different mode, which is to say thank you, to some thanks, because it's important in these concluding remarks to do this. And I do want to thank all the people who have given papers first. I mean, they've been, as I said earlier, for me, exhilarating, extraordinary in their range, variety, provocation. So thank you to them. I want to say, on behalf of UEA, a very warm thank you to Ashoka University for the generous way in which they have supported this event and made it possible, and to colleagues who I'm getting to know in Ashoka University, like Shoykot, which is very, very valuable, I think, I hope, to us and our future collaboration. I want to say a big thank you to Gautam, is he here? Who has, at least in my case, coped with dilatoriness and confusion with extraordinary grace, and has been, I think, extraordinarily helpful, I think, to others as well. So thank you very much, Gautam. But finally, I do want to thank Amit and what he makes possible. So Amit, thank you very much indeed for making this happen. That's it.
Everybody for coming here, for the speakers and others and you, the audience. Thank you so much for coming here and bringing this all together. But until next year then, bye.